21st of June, 1941, and the Soviet Union's vast frontier exploded into chaos as German bombers carved paths of destruction through the pre-dawn darkness. In the confusion of Operation Barbarossa's opening hours, a young navigation instructor named Viktor Talalikin scrambled to his Polikarpov Ur-16 fighter, his hands trembling not from fear, but from anticipation. The 23-year-old pilot had no idea that within weeks he would pioneer a tactic so audacious that Luftwaffe pilots would whisper about it in their barracks, half believing they faced a supernatural opponent rather than a flesh-and-blood adversary. But this story does not begin with Talalikin alone. It begins with Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, a name that would eventually become synonymous with nocturnal death itself. Born on the 16th of February, 1922, in the small town of Calw, Germany, Schnaufer grew up during the tumultuous interwar period when the Treaty of Versailles had left his nation's military aviation in shambles. His childhood was ordinary. The son of a wine merchant, he showed no particular martial inclinations. Yet something in the quiet, methodical boy suggested a predator's patience, a quality that would later make him the most lethal night fighter pilot in aviation history. The path to becoming what the British would fearfully call the Ghost of Saint-Trond began inauspiciously. Schnaufer joined the Luftwaffe in November 1939, just months after the war's outbreak. Unlike the flamboyant day fighter pilots who courted glory in theatrical dogfights above the clouds, Schnaufer volunteered for night fighter training, a branch considered by many to be aviation's backwater. Night fighting in 1940 was primitive, almost medieval in its reliance on luck and intuition. Pilots flew through absolute darkness, hunting bombers by moonlight and instinct, often unable to distinguish friend from foe until dangerously close. The technical challenges were staggering. Aircraft instruments of the era provided minimal guidance in darkness. Pilots suffered spatial disorientation, flying upside down without realizing it, or spiraling into the ground while certain they were climbing. The British Royal Air Force's Bomber Command exploited these limitations ruthlessly, launching increasingly devastating night raids against German industrial targets. By 1942, Germany desperately needed innovation in nocturnal warfare, and Schnaufer would provide it, though not through revolutionary technology, but through an almost preternatural understanding of the night itself. According to historical accounts preserved in the Bundesarchiv and detailed in multiple aviation journals including the Royal Air Force Historical Society's publications, Schnaufer's training revealed an uncanny aptitude. Where other pilots panicked in darkness, he relaxed. Where others saw nothing, he detected subtle variations in the night sky's texture, the faint silhouette of a bomber against stars, the barely perceptible exhaust glow from engines, the way searchlight beams caught on airframe surfaces miles away. His instructors noted something unsettling. Schnaufer seemed to think like the night itself, patient and unhurried, willing to stalk prey for hours. By late 1942, Schnaufer received his operational posting to Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, the Luftwaffe's premier night fighter wing. He was 20 years old, flying the Messerschmitt Bf 110, a twin-engine heavy fighter that sacrificed speed for endurance and firepower. The aircraft bristled with upward-firing cannons in a configuration called Schräge Musik, jazz music, that allowed attacks from below, where bombers had no defensive armament. This blind spot would become Schnaufer's killing ground. The winter of 1942 brought Schnaufer his first confirmed kill on the 1st of December, a Royal Air Force Halifax bomber caught in searchlights over the Netherlands. The engagement lasted mere seconds. A brief burst of cannon fire, the bomber's wing separating from its fuselage, then silence as the aircraft tumbled earthward. Most pilots would have celebrated, but Schnaufer's after-action report was clinical, almost detached. He noted the exact angle of approach, the optimal firing distance, the bomber's defensive reactions. Even in victory, he was studying, learning, perfecting his craft. What distinguished Schnaufer from other competent night fighters was his systematic approach to aerial combat. While colleagues relied on ground controllers to vector them toward targets, Schnaufer developed an intuitive understanding of British bomber tactics. He studied their formations, memorized their standard approach paths, and learned to anticipate where bomber streams would concentrate. Night after night, he would position himself not where the enemy was, but where they would be. The technology available to German night fighters improved considerably during this period. The Liechtenstein airborne radar system, though primitive by later standards, gave pilots like Schnaufer advance warning of nearby aircraft. Yet technology alone did not account for his success. Many pilots received the same equipment but achieved far fewer victories. The difference lay in Schnaufer's ability to merge man, machine, and darkness into a single hunting organism. His crew, particularly his radio operator Fritz Rumpelhart and gunner Wilhelm Gensler, became extensions of his will. Communication between them was sparse, almost telepathic. Rumpelhart would call out radar contacts with minimal information. Target, 11 o'clock, 3 kilometers slightly above. Schnaufer would acknowledge with a single word and begin his stalk, adjusting altitude and speed with minute control inputs. Gensler watched their 6 o'clock, protecting against British night fighters that increasingly prowled the same darkness. The spring of 1943 marked Schnaufer's transformation from competent pilot to ace. On the night of the 5th of March, during a major RAF raid on Essen, he shot down 4 bombers in a single sortie. The achievement earned him the Iron Cross First Class, but more importantly, it validated his methodology. Each victory that night followed an identical pattern: patient stalking, approach from the target's 7 o'clock low position, a climb into the blind spot beneath the bomber's fuselage, then a brief burst from the Schräge music cannons aimed at the wing root where fuel tanks clustered. British bomber crews began reporting encounters with a phantom attacker. Surviving gunners described it similarly. No warning, no visible enemy fighter, just sudden catastrophic explosions in their aircraft's wings or fuselage. Some crews never saw their killer at all, dying without knowing what had destroyed them. The psychological impact was devastating. Bomber command crews were already facing terrible odds. Average life expectancy for a bomber crewman was measured in missions, not months. But the invisible killer added a new dimension of terror. Intelligence officers initially dismissed the reports as confusion or exaggeration. Surely no pilot could consistently attack from such an unlikely angle, they reasoned. But as evidence accumulated, mostly from crashed German night fighters, that revealed the upward-firing cannon installations, the truth became clear. The Germans had developed a technique that exploited a fundamental vulnerability in British bomber design. By summer 1943, Schnaufer's reputation within the Nachtjagdgeschwader had taken on mythical proportions. Fellow pilots sought his advice, and he shared it freely: the proper altitude to patrol, how to use moonlight as camouflage rather than illumination, the importance of approaching from downwind to avoid detection. Yet even with this knowledge, few could replicate his success. Schnaufer possessed something that could not be taught: an almost supernatural patience coupled with split-second decisiveness when the moment arrived. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 that Schnaufer flew bore the markings G9 plus CC, a designation that would become infamous among Allied intelligence analysts. The aircraft itself was unremarkable, a workmanlike design prioritizing reliability over performance. What made it deadly was the pilot and the modification. The Schräge music installation, pioneered by pilots frustrated with the difficulty of matching speed with British bombers, consisted of 2 20mm cannons mounted in the fuselage at a 70-degree angle. This allowed the night fighter to fly beneath and slightly behind a bomber, matching its speed precisely, then fire upward into the target's most vulnerable areas. Historical records from the Luftwaffe personnel files, preserved in post-war archives and referenced extensively in Werner Held's authoritative work, Reichsverteidigung, detail Schnaufer's tactical evolution during this period. He began experimenting with attack profiles that minimized his exposure to defensive fire. Rather than the traditional stern approach that brought fighters directly into the gunner's sights, Schnaufer would maneuver into position far below the bomber stream, climb slowly to altitude, then level off directly beneath an unsuspecting target. The physics of this approach were elegant. British bombers typically flew between 15,000 and 20,000 feet. Schnaufer would patrol at 12,000 feet, using his radar to detect the bomber stream passing overhead. Once a target was identified, he would begin a shallow climb, keeping the bomber silhouetted against the lighter sky while his own aircraft remained invisible against the dark earth below. Visual contact usually came at a range of 300 meters, close enough to identify the aircraft type, far enough to remain undetected. The identification step was crucial. Schnaufer refused to fire until absolutely certain of his target's identity. Friendly fire incidents plagued night fighter operations, and he was determined to avoid adding to the toll. His exceptional eyesight allowed him to distinguish British bombers by their silhouette: the high-mounted engines of a Lancaster, the distinctive twin tail of a Halifax, the angular profile of a Sterling. Only after positive identification would he begin the final approach. This final phase separated masters from mere competence. Schnaufer would advance his throttles slightly, closing the distance to approximately 200 meters while maintaining position directly beneath the bomber's fuselage. At this range, his aircraft existed in the target's absolute blind spot, too far aft for the front turret, too far forward for the rear turret, and directly below where no guns could depress far enough to engage. The bomber's own engines masked any sound from Schnaufer's Messerschmitt. Then came the moment of execution. Schnaufer would ease back on the control column, raising his fighter's nose and bringing the upward-firing cannons to bear on the bomber's wing root. A 1-second to 2-second burst, perhaps 40 to 80 rounds total, would strike the target between the fuselage and inboard engine. This area contained main fuel tanks, structural spars, and control cables. The effect was catastrophic. Witnesses on the ground described bombers suddenly exploding in flight or breaking apart, wings folding upward as structural integrity failed. The autumn of 1943 transformed Schnaufer from a highly effective pilot into Germany's most deadly night fighter. On the night of the 22nd of October, during a massive British raid targeting Kassel, he achieved a feat that would have seemed impossible earlier in the war: 7 confirmed kills in a single night. The sortie lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes, during which Schnaufer systematically hunted through the bomber stream, destroying aircraft with mechanical efficiency. His logbook entries from that night, preserved in military archives, are remarkable for their brevity and precision. Each victory recorded with minimal detail: time, location, aircraft type, method of destruction. No exultation, no dramatic embellishment. To Schnaufer, this was work. Deadly, necessary work, but work nonetheless. Post-flight interviews revealed his methodology. He would destroy a bomber, immediately begin searching for the next target, attack, destroy, and repeat. The 4-hour sortie included 7 attacks and 7 kills, meaning he was continuously engaged in either hunting or attacking with almost no wasted time or motion. The Luftwaffe's propaganda machine struggled with Schnaufer. Unlike flamboyant aces who courted media attention, he remained intensely private. Photographs from this period show a lean young man with deep-set eyes and an almost ascetic appearance. He rarely smiled, gave terse interviews, and deflected credit to his crew. The propaganda ministry wanted heroes who embodied Nazi martial ideals: aggressive, boastful, ideologically committed. Schnaufer was none of these things. He was simply the best at killing bombers, and that would have to suffice. The winter of 1943-44 was particularly brutal for Bomber Command. Losses spiked dramatically as the Luftwaffe's night fighter force reached peak effectiveness. Schnaufer contributed significantly to these losses, adding another 23 confirmed kills between January and April 1944. Each represented a Lancaster, Halifax, or Sterling heavy bomber destroyed, along with its crew of 6 to 8 men. The mathematics were grim. 65 bombers destroyed by April 1944 meant approximately 400 to 500 Allied airmen killed or captured as a direct result of Schnaufer's actions. British intelligence agencies began piecing together information about the mysterious German pilot. Interrogations of Luftwaffe prisoners, analysis of night fighter radio traffic, and reports from agents in occupied territories gradually revealed that a single pilot was responsible for a disproportionate number of losses. The name Schnaufer appeared with increasing frequency in intelligence summaries, though details about him remained scarce. What was known was troubling. He flew consistently, he rarely missed, and he seemed to operate with near impunity. Bomber Command implemented countermeasures. New defensive tactics emphasized mutual support between aircraft, with gunners instructed to watch the blind spot beneath neighboring bombers. Electronic countermeasures attempted to jam German radar. Mosquito night fighters accompanied bomber streams hunting the hunters. Yet Schnaufer adapted to each change, modifying his tactics to maintain his advantage. When bombers began flying tighter formations, he attacked from different angles. When jamming degraded his radar, he relied more heavily on visual detection. When British night fighters appeared, he became more cautious, checking his tail more frequently and limiting his time in the target area. The 6th of June 1944, D-Day, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but it paradoxically represented the apex of Schnaufer's effectiveness. As Allied forces stormed Normandy's beaches, Bomber Command intensified operations against German transportation networks, oil facilities, and industrial targets. The increased sortie rate meant more targets for Germany's night fighters, and Schnaufer exploited the opportunity ruthlessly. June and July 1944 saw him add 26 more confirmed victories, bringing his total to 91. This period demonstrated not just his hunting skills, but his remarkable physical endurance. Night fighter operations imposed brutal demands on pilots. Long hours at high altitude, constant visual scanning in darkness, the stress of repeated combat, then landing exhausted at dawn. Most pilots flew 3 to 4 sorties per week. Schnaufer often flew nightly when weather permitted, sometimes multiple sorties in a single night. His promotion to Staffelkapitän, squadron leader, of the 4th Squadron of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 in March 1944, had expanded his responsibilities beyond personal combat effectiveness. He now bore responsibility for training younger pilots, developing squadron tactics, and managing administrative duties. Yet rather than diminish his combat effectiveness, leadership seemed to sharpen his skills. He could now coordinate multiple aircraft, directing less experienced pilots toward targets, while personally engaging the most difficult opponents. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 was becoming obsolescent by mid-1944, struggling to match the speed and altitude of the latest British bombers. The Luftwaffe began transitioning to the Junkers Ju-88, a more capable platform with better performance and improved radar. Schnaufer received his new aircraft in July 1944 and immediately began adapting his tactics to its characteristics. The Ju-88 was faster and could carry heavier armament, but it handled differently than the Bf 110. Within weeks, Schnaufer had mastered the new aircraft and resumed his devastating attacks. Allied intelligence analysts studying German night fighter effectiveness noticed a pattern. Losses tended to concentrate in specific geographic areas on specific nights, suggesting the work of particularly skilled pilots. Cross-referencing this data with interrogation reports and signals intelligence, they identified several super aces responsible for disproportionate casualties. Schnaufer's name topped this list. Recommendations went to Bomber Command headquarters: identify these pilots, track their movements, and eliminate them through targeted operations or special assassination missions. These proposals faced immediate ethical and practical objections. Deliberately targeting individual enemy combatants for assassination violated certain military traditions, even in total war. More practically, German night fighters operated under strict radio discipline, making them difficult to track. Their bases were dispersed and heavily defended. Any mission to eliminate specific pilots would cost Allied lives with uncertain results. The proposals were shelved, and the war would continue to be fought through conventional means. For Schnaufer, the summer of 1944 brought both triumph and tragedy. His victory total climbed steadily: 100 confirmed kills on the 24th of July, 110 by August. But the broader strategic situation was deteriorating catastrophically for Germany. Allied armies were advancing from both east and west. German cities were being systematically destroyed, and the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. September 1944 marked perhaps Schnaufer's most productive month. As the Allied advance stalled temporarily at Germany's borders and Bomber Command shifted to strategic targets deep in the Reich, opportunities for interception increased. Schnaufer's squadron operated from Saint-Trond airfield in Belgium, until the Allied advance forced a hasty evacuation, then from bases in western Germany. The constant relocations would have disrupted most units, but Schnaufer's squadron maintained operational effectiveness through meticulous planning and his own unshakable competence. On the night of the 21st of September, Schnaufer achieved another milestone that cemented his legend: 9 confirmed victories in a single sortie. The mission began unremarkably enough. A bomber stream approaching Mönchengladbach detected by ground radar, Schnaufer scrambling with his usual crew. What followed was a masterclass in aerial hunting. Over 4 hours, he methodically destroyed 9 British bombers, primarily Lancasters and Halifaxes, using a combination of radar guidance and visual acquisition. Each attack followed his proven methodology: approach from below, identify the target, maneuver into the blind spot, fire a precise burst, break away, begin searching for the next victim. Ground controllers monitoring the operation were astounded. Radio traffic from that night, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, captures their growing disbelief as Schnaufer called in kill after kill. Pock, pock, the code word for confirmed destruction, echoed repeatedly from his aircraft. Post-mission analysis confirmed all 9 victories, scattered across 60 kilometers of German airspace. The achievement earned Schnaufer the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, making him one of Germany's most decorated servicemen. British bomber crews who survived that night brought back confused and terrifying accounts. Multiple crews reported being alone in their defensive box, when suddenly their neighboring aircraft simply exploded without warning. Gunners swore they had maintained vigilant watches, but saw nothing before their comrades' bombers disintegrated. The psychological warfare aspect of Schnaufer's success was significant. Knowing an invisible predator stalked the night skies affected crew morale profoundly. The autumn also brought command changes. Schnaufer was promoted to Gruppenkommandeur, group commander, of the 4th Group of Nachtjagdgeschwader 4 in October 1944. This represented command of roughly 30 to 40 aircraft and their crews, a substantial leadership responsibility. Most officers at this level reduced their personal combat flying to focus on administration. Schnaufer did the opposite, maintaining an aggressive operational tempo while simultaneously managing his enlarged command. His tactical innovations during this period influenced German night fighter doctrine broadly. Schnaufer advocated for aggressive freelancing, allowing experienced pilots to hunt independently rather than relying entirely on ground control guidance. This approach maximized the effectiveness of aces like himself, while giving less experienced pilots the freedom to develop their own skills. It also complicated Allied countermeasures, as the more random German patrol patterns were harder to predict and avoid. November and December 1944 saw Schnaufer add 27 more confirmed victories despite increasingly difficult conditions. The Luftwaffe's fuel situation was becoming critical, limiting flying hours. Allied fighter sweeps made German airfields dangerous even on the ground. The quality of replacement pilots was declining as training programs collapsed under relentless pressure. Yet Schnaufer continued hunting, his experience and skill allowing him to achieve results that younger pilots could not. The winter of 1944-45 was Germany's death agony, yet it paradoxically represented Schnaufer's absolute zenith as a night fighter pilot. His confirmed victory count reached 121 by January 1, 1945, making him the highest-scoring night fighter pilot in aviation history, a record that stands unbroken to this day. The number is almost incomprehensible. 121 4-engine bombers destroyed, representing somewhere between 700 and 900 Allied airmen killed or captured through his direct action. The mechanics of achieving such a total reveal both the strategic situation and Schnaufer's extraordinary competence. By early 1945, the Allies were conducting round-the-clock bombing campaigns, with American bombers attacking by day and British bombers by night. This meant more targets but also more danger, as Allied fighter escorts had achieved air superiority even at night. British Mosquito night fighters, operating with sophisticated radar and crewed by experienced hunters, actively sought German night fighters. Schnaufer's tactics evolved to counter this threat. He became even more cautious, spending more time observing before committing to an attack. His crew, now including Wilhelm Gensler as gunner and Barrow as radio operator, functioned with practiced efficiency. They could communicate through minimal radio calls, often just single words or clicks of the transmitter. This radio discipline made them difficult for Allied direction-finding equipment to locate. The Junkers Ju-88 that Schnaufer flew during this final phase bristled with armament. In addition to the standard Schräge music installation, his aircraft mounted forward-firing cannons and even experimental weapons like the Spanner infrared detection system. The latter allowed detection of bomber exhaust heat signatures from several kilometers away, providing advance warning even when radar was being jammed. Though the system was temperamental and rarely decisive, it represented the technological edge Schnaufer sought constantly. January and February 1945 brought particularly heavy fighting. Bomber Command was systematically destroying what remained of Germany's industrial infrastructure and transportation networks while simultaneously supporting the Soviet advance from the east. The sheer volume of Allied aircraft over Germany increased Schnaufer's opportunities, but also his danger. Multiple times he narrowly avoided British night fighters, surviving through situational awareness and his aircraft's maneuverability. On the night of the 4th of February 1945, Schnaufer engaged in what would become his final major combat success. During a raid on Mainz, he destroyed 6 British bombers in a single sortie, bringing his total to 121. The mission nearly ended in disaster when a British Mosquito night fighter detected him after his 6th kill and initiated an attack. Only desperate maneuvering, a spiraling dive through clouds that brought Schnaufer's Junkers dangerously close to the ground, allowed escape. The incident shook even his legendary composure. For perhaps the first time, he confronted his own mortality. The end came not with a final blaze of glory, but with quiet obsolescence. By March 1945, fuel shortages had become so acute that the Luftwaffe could barely operate. Schnaufer's last combat sortie occurred on the 20th of March, a frustrating patrol that yielded no contacts due to poor weather. After that, operations virtually ceased. The war's final weeks saw him grounded, first by lack of fuel, then by the general collapse of German resistance. The 8th of May, 1945, brought Germany's unconditional surrender and with it, the end of Schnaufer's combat career. He was 23 years old and had survived more than 500 combat sorties, a statistical improbability given the lethality of night fighting. His final confirmed victory total stood at 121 four-engine bombers destroyed, plus an additional 8 unconfirmed, making him the highest-scoring night fighter pilot of any nation, ever. The immediate post-war period was chaotic for German military personnel. Schnaufer and his surviving squadron mates found themselves in British custody, subject to lengthy interrogations by Allied intelligence officers eager to understand German night fighter tactics. These interrogations, preserved in the British National Archives, reveal Schnaufer's cooperation and his continuing professional pride in his unit's achievements, despite the war's outcome. He discussed tactics freely, explained the Schräge music system, and provided technical assessments of various aircraft types. British intelligence officers found Schnaufer enigmatic. They had expected either a fanatical Nazi or a boastful warrior, and he was neither. Instead, they encountered a soft-spoken professional who discussed aerial combat with the detachment of an engineer describing manufacturing processes. When asked about the men he had killed, potentially 900 Allied airmen, Schnaufer reportedly fell silent, then said simply, "It was war. They were bombing my homeland. I did my duty." No remorse, but no celebration either. Denazification proceedings cleared Schnaufer relatively quickly. Unlike many high-ranking Luftwaffe officers, he had never been a Nazi party member and had avoided the political entanglements that complicated post-war existence for others. His record showed no war crimes. He had shot down military aircraft in legitimate combat, nothing more. By 1946, he was released from custody and faced the daunting challenge of building a civilian life. The adjustment proved difficult. Schnaufer's entire adult life had revolved around flying and fighting. The skills that made him a legendary night fighter pilot, patience, visual acuity, split-second decision-making under stress, had limited application in occupied, devastated Germany. He attempted various jobs, struggling with the mundane nature of peacetime existence. Friends from the war years reported that he seemed diminished, as though essential parts of his being had been left in the night skies over Germany. In 1948, an opportunity emerged. The French wine merchant family that owned vineyards in Alsace offered Schnaufer employment managing their operations, a role that leveraged his background. His father had been a wine merchant before the war. Schnaufer accepted and began what appeared to be a successful transition to civilian life. He married Maria Hedwig in 1949, and the couple settled in the town of Bordeaux, France, where Schnaufer managed wine distribution operations. The irony of Germany's deadliest night ace living peacefully in France working with wine, the very opposite of his wartime profession, was not lost on those who knew his history. Yet Schnaufer seemed content, or at least resigned to his new existence. Photographs from this period show him looking older than his 27 years, as though the war had aged him prematurely. The deep-set eyes that once scanned night skies for bombers now evaluated wine vintages and commercial contracts. The 15th of July, 1950, began as an ordinary summer day. Schnaufer, now 28 years old, was traveling by truck along a road near Bordeaux, returning from a business meeting regarding wine distribution. The details of what happened next come from French police reports and eyewitness accounts, preserved in local archives and later examined by aviation historians. A large American military truck, operated by United States occupation forces still stationed in Europe, was traveling in the opposite direction. Exactly what caused the collision remains unclear. Some reports suggest mechanical failure, others driver error, still others simply unfortunate timing. What is certain is that the vehicles collided head-on at significant speed. Schnaufer, sitting in the passenger seat, bore the brunt of the impact. He died at the scene from massive traumatic injuries. The driver of his vehicle survived with serious injuries. The American servicemen were largely unharmed. There was no indication of foul play, no suggestion of anything except terrible coincidence. The man who had survived more than 500 combat sorties against the most powerful air forces in history, who had dodged British night fighters and Allied flak, who had emerged from the war without a serious wound, was killed in a traffic accident on a peaceful summer day. The news reached Germany slowly, spreading through informal networks of former Luftwaffe personnel. Reactions varied. Some found grim irony in the manner of his death. The legendary hunter brought down not by enemy action, but by peacetime accident. Others saw tragedy in a young life cut short just as he was building a new existence. A few noted the date, just 5 years and 2 months after the war's end, and wondered if he had ever truly escaped the conflict that had defined him. French authorities handled the funeral arrangements. Schnaufer was buried in a small cemetery near Bordeaux on the 18th of July, 1950. The ceremony was quiet, attended primarily by his widow Maria and a handful of business associates. No military honors, no acknowledgement of his wartime achievements. He was interred as a civilian who had died in an accident, nothing more. In the following decades, his grave became a site of occasional pilgrimage for aviation historians and enthusiasts. The headstone is simple, marking only his name, birth date, and death date, with no mention of his military service. This anonymity seemed appropriate somehow. In life, Schnaufer had avoided publicity and attention, and his final resting place reflected that same austere simplicity. His widow Maria never remarried, living quietly in France until her own death decades later. She rarely discussed her husband's wartime experiences, preferring to remember him as the wine merchant she had married rather than the combat pilot who had preceded that incarnation. The few interviews she granted portrayed Schnaufer as a man haunted not by guilt, but by disconnection. He had been extraordinary at something that peacetime rendered irrelevant, and he never fully reconciled that loss of purpose. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer's legacy exists in uncomfortable tension with modern sensibilities. He was unquestionably a brilliant tactician, an extraordinarily skilled pilot whose technical innovations influenced night fighting doctrine. Yet his brilliance served a regime whose evil is beyond dispute, and his victims were Allied airmen engaged in the legitimate military objective of destroying Nazi Germany's capacity to wage war. Historical assessment must grapple with both realities simultaneously. The numbers remain staggering even decades later. 121 confirmed four-engine bomber victories, likely representing between 700 and 900 Allied airmen killed or captured. Each of those men was someone's son, many were husbands or fathers. All were volunteers fighting against fascism. British and American historians understandably focus on these human costs when discussing Schnaufer, while German accounts tend to emphasize his tactical brilliance and professional skill. Aviation historians generally treat Schnaufer as a case study in maximizing effectiveness within a specific combat environment. His systematic approach, studying enemy tactics, developing counter-tactics, practicing until execution was flawless, then applying those skills relentlessly, represents a template for achieving expertise in any competitive endeavor. Military academies in various nations have studied his methods, extracting lessons about situational awareness, crew coordination, and tactical patience while carefully divorcing these lessons from their historical context. The Schräge Musik tactic that Schnaufer employed so effectively became his most enduring tactical legacy. Post-war analysis by Allied air forces revealed just how vulnerable their bombers had been to this attack method. The British in particular studied captured German night fighters and interrogation reports, leading to significant changes in bomber defensive design. Future aircraft would feature ventral turrets or radar-directed tail guns capable of engaging threats from below, explicitly designed to counter the blind spot attacks that Schnaufer had perfected. Modern German commemoration of Schnaufer reflects contemporary sensitivities about Wehrmacht glorification. Unlike the Third Reich, which celebrated aces as propaganda tools, modern Germany approaches military history with profound caution. Schnaufer appears in historical exhibitions and academic works, but without the heroic framing common in some other nations' treatment of their combat aces. The emphasis falls on technical and tactical aspects rather than personal celebration. In Britain, Schnaufer exists primarily in the historical consciousness through the memoirs and accounts of Bomber Command veterans. Those who survived the war and later learned they had been operating in the same airspace as Schnaufer expressed a grudging respect for his skill while maintaining appropriate perspective about the war's broader context. Several veterans noted in interviews that they would rather have been shot down by a professional like Schnaufer, whose attacks were swift and gave crews chance to bail out, than by flak or collision which offered no such opportunity. The final accounting of Schnaufer's life resists simple narratives. He was neither a fanatic Nazi nor a reluctant conscript, but rather a professional military officer who performed his duties with exceptional skill in service to an evil cause. His personal motivations appear to have centered on professional pride and defense of his homeland, rather than ideological commitment, though this distinction provides limited moral comfort to the families of his victims. What remains indisputable is his position in aviation history, the most effective night fighter pilot ever to fly, achieving a record that will almost certainly never be broken, given modern warfare's character. This achievement derived from a unique combination of natural talent, systematic preparation, tactical innovation, and the grim circumstances that provided him with opportunities to apply these qualities. His story reminds us that extraordinary human capability can manifest in service to any cause, and that technical brilliance exists independently of moral worth. This account draws upon multiple historical sources, including official Luftwaffe operational records preserved in the Bundesarchiv, British Royal Air Force historical documents, and scholarly works such as Werner Held's Reichsverteidigung, The Night Fighting over Germany. These materials provide the factual foundation for understanding Schnaufer's combat career, though interpretations of his motivations and legacy continue,